Hello, my name is Alison and I'm the founder of HoneyBadgerRadio. I hope you enjoy this content. Jordan Peterson has gone into rehab for a possible addiction to anti-anxiety medication clonazepam. His wife, Tammy, was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, and he went on the drug in order to cope with the stress. This situation with Jordan Peterson has inspired some, let's call them existential crises among the usual suspects and some of the unusual suspects, and a recent Twitter storm over this video. Seriously? Oh, should I redo it? You're no help.
The situation where you've said something on Twitter and, 1,000 people mob you publicly. I mean, your first response, your first response is going to be to examine your own conscience and see how you transgressed. It's not really much different psychologically. I mean, it's lesser, I suppose, but it's not that much different than waking up one morning and coming to your door and finding a mob of your neighbors angrily aggregated on your lawn. It's a terrible shock for people, and it really hurts them. They're often, by all accounts, damaged for lengthy periods of time by this.
Alison Rothberg writes, "He just cries and shakes for 50 minutes. What a terribly stupid, weak man." Reading is for demons, opines. Surprising absolutely no one, anti-PC warlord and masculinity instructor Jordan Peterson is seen here literally crying about how people are mean to him on Twitter. Ian Miles Chung says, "I've enjoyed his work, but Jordan Peterson is lost. He's had a horrific mental break during his recent interview with Rex Murphy, where he literally cries about getting mean tweets. Become anti-fragile or die." I just want to point one thing out. Peterson is connecting his own dreadful experience with Twitter mobs to what other people go through. He isn't crying about himself, but about man's inhumanity to man. So seriously stop this nonsense that this is all about him. It isn't. It's about recognizing that Twitter is one of the most destructive mediums that human beings have ever created. I referred to it as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse in a previous speech, namely wrath, the sin of wrath, because almost all Twitter is mobs of people dunking on each other. And it's really unpleasant to see, and I can see why he would be somewhat deeply disturbed by it. All right, moving on. That was the bad. If you can believe it, there's also the ugly. I'll be dealing with you later, Peter Coffin. But first, a word from our sponsor. If you enjoy our content and believe in the work that we do, not just creating content for all of the streaming platforms, but putting on events to advance the cause of men's rights in the real world, why don't you support? What would make you support the work that Honey Badger Radio does? Really think about your answer to that question. And send the answer to topic@badgerpod.com. And if the answer to why you don't support is why not, go to feedthebadger.com to help us out with our current fundraisers or purchase a subscription. Lots of great rewards for helping us out. That's feedthebadger.com. You can also look in the low bar for a set of options to support us. Now back to your regularly scheduled program. And the word is regularly, not blah, 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 blah. All right. In addition to the usual suspects, like Peter Coffin, some more conservative commentators have also had some sketchy things to say about Peterson going into rehab. B.J. Campbell writes, "My task and responsibility as the father and husband was to hold the family together through what I hope will be the darkest part of any of our lives. I didn't go to a therapist. I didn't use a counselor. My confidants during this time were my wife and one other close friend. My toolkit to make sense of the chaos around me and maintain the strength to get to the end consisted of 3 things: writing, I started this publication mostly as a distraction; nicotine, I started vaping for a bit. I truly think this helped. I watched Jordan Peterson videos. Jordan's wife, Tammy, was struck with a rare kidney cancer in the summer, no more than a few months after Buffy died. Tammy had significant surgery. The surgery had complications, and her lymphatic system was compromised, leading to ascites just like Buffy. I read the articles. I wondered if Jordan was at home using vacuum-sealed Pleurex drain bottles to suck the fluid out of his wife's belly through a surgically installed catheter, like I'd done months before. I wondered if Tammy would die, like Buffy did. And I wondered what Jordan was doing to manage his stress and battle his dragon. Did you really wonder at the time? As of several days ago, we know most of these answers. His wife will recover, if with fewer organs, her ascites has abated, and Jordan managed his situation with a drug called clonazepam, at the direction of his own doctors, to which he is now addicted and must seek drug rehabilitation in it. Are you guys done? Seriously. To which he is now addicted and must seek drug rehabilitation in a clinic. I don't stand in judgment of Jordan for turning to pharmaceuticals to manage stress, as so many others in the Western world do. BJ, you say you don't stand in judgment of Jordan's choice, but you said this. I still have a bottle of the anti-anxiety medication lorazepam in my medicine cabinet that neither Buffy nor I ever opened. There's no reason to include this detail, except to flex on Peterson. A lesson emerges from a careful unpacking that I think may be beneficial for everyone to think about. Let's begin by comparing these situations. My situation, both from a medical and family perspective, was probably objectively worse. Buffy struggled for far longer and didn't survive. My children are younger and more impressionable and lost their mother. I am now a single father, and while I do well professionally, I don't make anything like Jordan does. Your situation was objectively worse. But Jordan's situation was worse in different ways. He's stranded, arguably by choice, at the front lines of a culture war, and embattled by a media engine which revels in mischaracterizing him to reap clickbait money. This is a stress layer I can't fathom. Yet you still say that your situation is objectively worse, even though you can't fathom the level of stress he's under. Okay. Do you have an actual conclusion here? Was a judgment necessary? Also, arguably by choice sounds very much like a dismissal. Because he chose it, he doesn't have a right to have it recognized as a burden? Are you one of those people who dismisses anything done to soldiers because they're volunteers? Peterson has volunteered to be a conscript in a war you aren't fighting, BJ. You're sitting on the sidelines, flexing on him for failing to be as strong as you in your objectively worse situation. And you are flexing on him, my dude. Peterson right now is in a no man's land of what behavioral scientists call repeated social defeat. Now, what is repeated social defeat? Scientists trying to find ways to induce depression in rodents have developed a protocol called repeated social defeat. What they do is they introduce a mouse to the cage of a more dominant mouse, and they do it repeatedly over time. So the mouse can experience over and over what it's like to be subjugated and forced into submission, what it's like to be castigated, maligned, cast out, and treated as socially inferior, sort of like what the media is doing to Peterson. That's what they do in order to induce drug-resistant depression in rodents. Drug-resistant. So a depression that does not respond to drugs at all. And what does that sound like to you? What does that process sound like to you? One of the greatest burdens, if not the greatest, you can carry in a social species is social rejection. That's the burden Jordan Peterson has chosen to carry. He's chosen to pick up that burden to push back against society's vitriolic, pervasive anti-male sentiment for the benefit of young men everywhere. Doing anything outside the boxes we're expected to occupy means facing the no man's land, the desert, of repeated social defeat. It means being willing to endure being lied about, ridiculed, excluded, banned, deplatformed, harassed, threatened, and then accused of having all the power and doing all of that to the people with the power who are doing it to you. I'm not going to say traveling in that no man's land is as bad as being in literal combat. After all, combat is basically repeated social defeat with bullets. That's why sergeants scream at new recruits to get them used to the feeling of being violently hated. But it's awful to lose a loved one. No doubt about it, BJ. It's beyond awful. But when you experience repeated social defeat, when you experience this, you become the loved one you've lost. If you have boys, Jordan Peterson is bearing that burden for them. If you have girls, he's also bearing this burden so that they will have a man in the future that is all fit to be a partner. The fact that this was a burden he chose is actually astounding to me. It's astounding to me that when someone sacrifices so much to try to help others. Paul Elam of A Voice for Men did something along those lines as well. He faced down the media smear, the specter of repeated social rejection that everyone fears on a visceral level if you're part of a social species. It's our greatest fear. Humiliation eclipses almost every other form of anxiety. It could be considered anxiety plus fear of death. And we will do anything to avoid it. And yet there are some people who go into that no man's land for the sake of others. And Paul Elam was one, Jordan Peterson was one. BJ continues, I unconsciously trusted the things he was saying were true. And I still think many of them are true, and were certainly helpful to me. But I can acknowledge that they were only useful in part because I trusted they were useful. That authority bias worked like a placebo, and placebos have real effects on top of whatever effects his actual advice imparted. It's one thing to read Peterson's work critically, and certainly I have had my own criticisms of his work. It's another thing entirely to think that him going into rehab somehow negates anything that he said. It doesn't, unless you shouldn't have believed that thing in the first place. Jordan was missing a tool that I had because Jordan Peterson can't just watch Jordan Peterson videos. And that's both horrible and fascinating and worth a deeper look. Jordan Peterson videos were helpful to me because I imparted an unconscious authority bias into the things he was saying. The assumption behind this is that Peterson's weakness needs an explanation. And you know what they say about assumptions, BJ? Jordan, on the other hand, can't assign that authority bias to himself. For him to fight his dragon in the same way I fought mine, he would need a meta Jordan Peterson to watch on YouTube. Someone else higher up on the ladder of self-help abstraction, of more authority than he. So this is Campbell's conclusion why Jordan failed while he succeeded. Peterson didn't have a Peterson. And that is where this is all leading. Campbell is explaining why he got over his objectively worse situation without becoming allegedly addicted to a pharmaceutical, and Peterson did. But here's the thought, BJ. Maybe Peterson isn't displaying weakness. No, just bear with me. Let me explain. Peterson chose to use a prescribed drug to cope. He then got addicted to it, presumably. Could be that he didn't. Peterson could have chosen to inform no one of this publicly, and yet he did. This is an intentional act, and if it's an intentional act, that itself must be accounted for before you judge him weak. This isn't him being caught in the act of being flawed. This is him showing you that he is flawed. There is a huge difference there, a critical one. Toxic masculinity, according to some feminists, maybe most, is men's desire not to be seen as weak. Because feminism refuses to see the burdens men carry, the sacrifices they make, or the vulnerabilities they have, male tears mugs, when a man stumbles, all they can do is call him fragile and blame him for somehow managing to fail, despite the fact that everyone, according to feminism, everyone else, that is society, minorities, everyone but men, is carrying him. If you can't recognize the burdens men carry, that means they can never set them down. Oh shit, I just realized something. Feminism says that everyone is carrying men except other men, and then blames men for not trusting other men with their own issues. Okay. All right, that's interesting, but I'll talk more about it later. If you can't recognize the burdens that men carry, that means men can never set them down. Oh, you've fallen and you can't get up. Here's another thing for you to carry, because we can't acknowledge that you fell because we're making you carry too much. Men's rights, on the other hand, is about seeing the weight that men carry when they stumble and fall. Men's rights recognizes the burdens men carry, and because it recognizes the burdens men carry, instead of seeing weakness, men's rights sees strength, the strength men show, how far a man walked, and how very much he carried. So let's apply some men's rights to this situation with Peterson. Peterson going into rehab, and the very, very, very many people who are gloating or flexing on him or otherwise acting like a dog that scored some cat shit. BJ says that Peterson's choice to take chlorhexidine was a bad choice. I have some experience with bad choices, in particular experience with bad choices in connection with running a convention. In that context, I have been told, "You made a bad choice, Alison." And I have had to say, yes, I did make a bad choice, but the choice I made was between something bad and something worse. If I may be so bold, I think Peterson made a choice between something bad and something worse. People want their father figures to be infinitely wise, infinitely strong, infinitely resilient, but we are all, every single one of us, human. And it's more courageous to struggle against our human limitations than to be infinitely strong. And that's what makes us all so brave. It's not courage to have an endless reservoir of personal strength. It's courage to make a bad choice for the sake of others. And it's even more courageous to own that bad choice and manage the fallout for the sake of yourself and those who rely on you. We only ever see the bad choice. We never see the worst choice because it's not the choice that was taken. I can't tell you what Peterson was thinking. I can only tell you what I see. He chose to be strong for his family. He chose to be strong for young men and ultimately all of us. And he chose to take a drug, to do both. And then he chose to be honest about needing help. I don't see weakness in any of these choices. I only see strength. Peterson decided to walk into the desert of the real, the no man's land of repeated social defeat. He decided to beat his heart against the biggest wall in our world, which is the wall between young men and any compassion whatsoever. That's the real thing that condemned him in the eyes of the Church of Women Worsting, in the eyes of the media. The Church of Women Worsting, the Church of Women Always Have It Worst. He was apostate in that church because he recognized that young men are being marginalized. The story of Peterson isn't the story of 12 rules or clean your room or carry the greatest weight you can. It's the story of a man with compassion for other men. He wrote that book because he felt it was what young men needed to hear. He spoke against the excesses of a society hell-bent on demonizing and stigmatizing young men because he felt that's what young men needed to hear. And he gave them an encouraging word because, once again, he felt that's what young men needed to hear. We don't see young men, all of us as a society, we don't see young men as worthy of scholarships, assistance, overcoming the trials of life, concern for their issues or mental health and physical well-being. Instead, we see them as a trash can to throw all our worst impulses into: blame, hatred, anger, vitriol, insults, contempt, and then we condemn them some more for achieving despite being our shit can. Imagine being told by society that you have no innate value, you're not just worthless, you are the reason why women and girls suffer unfairly. Imagine experiencing the despair of that, having no job, no education, no prospects, no hope, and being told that you actually are capable of making the world just a little bit better by cleaning your room. By a simple act completely within your control, you can bring value into the world. To acknowledge that young men are so marginalized now that they need to be told that there is anything they can do to make the world a better place, that they aren't a disease whose existence contaminates and taints everything around them, that by a simple act, They can bring value into the world. That is taking on the burden of society's hatred, blame, contempt, anger, and vitriol. Because our society doesn't want to acknowledge what it's doing to its sons. Compassion is fundamentally different than pity. Pity looks at another's suffering and sees weakness. Compassion looks at another's suffering and sees strength. It sees the burdens they've carried. It takes strength to have compassion, because to have compassion, you must be able to recognize the burdens that others carry. Do you carry that burden, BJ? Do you have compassion for Peterson now that he could use some? Or do you just see him as a psychological tool, one step in an infinite regression of authority and agency? If you don't recognize the burden Peterson has carried, then it's likely because you have never carried it, BJ. Your situation isn't comparable. Peterson had every right to only take the burdens forced on him by life. Like you did, BJ. You only took on the burdens you had no choice to take on at all. And now Peterson is no longer useful to you. You do what feminists do. You use him one last time to serve your ego. Only strong people can feel compassion, because only strong people choose to carry burdens. So only strong people see the burdens others have carried. Weak people have pity. When I read 12 Rules, I felt it was incomplete. What I felt was missing, well, there's a lot of things to live up to, but not much explanation how to do it, or the role that other people have in your life to help you do it. There wasn't much on finding the right foundation so you can lift the greatest weight as a young man or a young woman. The fact that if you don't find a good foundation, a good supportive community, you're not going to be able to lift much weight at all. That's the stuff I work with, trying to create good communities for young men that lift them up rather than tearing them down. I think what young men need now more than ever is not another standard to live up to, but people who recognize the strength they have already and build on that. It takes tremendous strength to just exist in a society that offers nothing to young men but condemnation and blistering hatred. Literally, young men, almost from the moment they're born, are thrust into the no man's land of repeated social defeat. And to even survive it is a triumph. Young men need to find a place that recognizes their strength where everyone else sees weakness and failure. I know that my advocacy for these issues, well, let's just say every time I tell a mental health care worker what I do, they give me a very skeptical face, like, you have problems with depression and anxiety and you do this for a living? It's possible that my advocacy for these issues will kill me. I'll do my best to maintain my mental health and resilience, but depression is a sneaky, underhanded thief. Those deadly habits of thinking are always there, like a ghost in your brain, and they don't announce themselves. They just slip in under your radar, under your guard, and change how you see the world. That's not to say that we aren't all responsible for maintaining our mental health, which I do. Every day I spend hours managing my symptoms and my mental health habits. But I deal with the pain of opening my heart to tragedy over and over again, caring over and over again, beating my heart against that wall, reading the same lazy lies about what I do over and over again, dealing with the no man's land of social defeat, border bannings, bias in application of law, calls for deplatforming and censorship, being told I'm a stain on humanity and a worthless, selfish child. I make myself a target by entering that no man's land of repeated social defeat. Because people who put us in boxes use that no man's land to maintain their boxes. They don't want people surviving it. Because if people can survive it, then they can get out of the boxes. And then there's the knowledge that my income is unreliable. All of that anxiety fuels my depression. This work I'm doing could be taking years off my life, 10 years, 20, don't know. Just like Peterson, I could do a lot more for my mental health by not doing this work. Doing this work increases the chances that a ghost of old habits will seize me and drag me down. But I do it anyway, because I won't walk away. I don't want you to have to face this stuff alone, because I know I'm able to give you arguments that stop those ugly lies in their tracks and allow you to endure one more day in the no man's land. I want you to get out of those boxes. I want you to be free. And for those of us who have felt the razor edge of despair and fear, we see the pain others go through and we sympathize. And it's much harder to walk away. Is that irresponsible of me? Is it irresponsible of a fireman, a policeman, or a soldier? They all choose jobs to choose to do things that put their lives at risk. When I look at this reaction to Peterson going into rehab, I wonder, if I do end up dying because of this, will you say I'm taking the coward's way out? Will you see me as weak? Or will you recognize that I fought hard against two fronts, mental illness and repeated social defeat, in order to do what I do to protect those who no one cares about? Would you see me as weak? Well, if I've fought two fronts, Jordan Peterson has fought three. He has fought media smearing, mental illness, and his wife getting cancer. Some of the criticisms of Peterson come from people who, well, wouldn't want to give young men any support at all. Men or young men. Not even hard love, much less love. They say Peterson's message of self-reliance is unethical because of systemic problems. But see, Peterson says it almost entirely to young men, and it's not like the people criticizing the message are offering any kind of support or recognition of the systematic problems facing young men. So what else are these young men going to get? Except, they have to take responsibility for their own problems because no one's going to help them. Unless you're going to change that. Peter Coffin. And then there's BJ, who seems to see Peterson stumbling as an opportunity to explain where Peterson's weakness came from, under the assumption that there is a weakness there that needs to be explained. And as you know, BJ, assumptions make an ass of you. Remember, before you judge someone weak for making a bad choice, you didn't see the worst choice. And speaking of bad choices, here's good news. Wow. Actually, that segue doesn't work. Anyway, HoneyBadgerRadio will be reprising our successful Amsterdam meetup from last year. This year, November 16th at the Westergasfabriek, which I probably butchered. This time we'll have our own venue, and maybe there will be some speechifying. Karen will be joining us if we can make our current fundraising goal. So support Badgerdam 2019 here, so you can have a Karen at the event and a Dr. Randomer Cam. November 17th, I'll be making a run on the UK border to attend Messages for Men. I may not be successful because the UK is part of the Five Eyes with the US, and the US has flagged me as an undesirable. But if I do manage to hop the border, I will be there. On November 19th, if it's funded, I'll be going to Oslo for the Man's Forum Conference. Yay! And I'll keep you posted on possible Badger meetups in Dublin, November 23rd, and Rome, November, I don't know. But we'll see if something happens in Rome. The way we're going to overcome the insanity around us is by building a strong and connected men's rights community that recognizes the burdens men carry, thus their strength. One day, I'm certain our little community will be called upon to be the thread that pulls everything broken back together, because that thread is always a story of love, and men's rights is the best love story. So if you want to support building a community based on the one force no one can resist, go to feedthebadger.com and feed our European shenanigans, and get yourself some swagging rights while you do it. Being in the no man's land of repeated social defeat is not fun. I don't think I'd be able to do it without the support you give. Some of you send letters, and some of you send care packages in the form of one-time donations and subscriptions. That really helps, knowing someone doesn't just appreciate what I'm doing, but is giving me the means to continue to do it, and sending it to me so I can continue the fight. I want to thank Charles, who lifted the most weight to make the screening of Erasing Family in Saskatoon happen. I want to thank Ruby, who didn't just send in a care package, but a care Great. And D, who parachuted in a damn tank, which I'm still boggling over, but thank you. I'll figure out what I'm going to use it for. I'm definitely going to use it for something. So thank you to Charles, Ruby, and D for all of your generosity. Please support our efforts strengthening the men's rights community, either through a one-time donation or to our current fundraiser, or by choosing an option for ongoing support. You can find those options here at feedthebadger.com or in the low bar. In conclusion, I want to say this. Dr. Peterson, you have nothing to prove. Thank you for your compassion and your strength. And thank you all for your kind attention. As her lymph system started to fail. Boy, you're really going crazy on that sisal pole, aren't you?